This is Time and Other Thieves, reflections and conversations on the nature of existence. I'm Sarah B., and today I'm going to share a recording of a lecture I did on Zoom back in May of 2025. It's called Group as Spiritual Practice, and I offered this lecture twice. Actually, the first time was in April of last year, and then I followed it up a few weeks later and charged a fee for a smaller crowd for continuing ed credits. And I finally got around to editing it for this podcast. I did not include any of the participants' additions. There was some very good discussion involved throughout and at the end of this lecture, but I edited all of that out. So you'll just hear my voice. And of course, you won't be able to see any of the slides I'm referring to. So for the most case, that won't be a huge issue. There might be a couple moments where you're not sure who I'm talking about, but hopefully I will eventually clarify it, or you can use context clues to figure it out for yourself. Enjoy. I'm Sarah Simpson. I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor in the state of North Carolina. I live in the Asheville area. I've been in private practice since 2016, and I just started running groups last July, so pretty new to group, but I like to think that what I lack in experience, I make up for in obsession and passion and constant training and reading and just always thinking about it. And that includes when I read spiritual stuff. I've had an interest in spirituality most of my life. And since I became so passionate about groups, being in them and running them, when reading various spiritual texts, I was constantly making connections back to group. And it would often seem like these people, these spiritual writers, could be talking about group. So it happened enough over and over again. Also listening to podcasts. I think it was the Dave Smith Dharma podcast that finally clinched it for me. Again, here he is. This man has never been in a process group, and it just sounds like he's talking about group. So I really wanted to put these ideas into some kind of digestible format and hopefully write a book one day and maybe teach a college class on this topic. And there's so many ways you could go with it. I tend to lead toward Buddhism as my spiritual path, but I'm really interested in all types of spirituality and full-on religion. So we'll get into some of my favorite spiritual teachers and how their ideas can be applied to group, even though they're not specifically talking about group. So process groups, spirituality, I thought we could start by just defining these terms. So what is a process group? Quite literally, it's a group of strangers who commit to meeting on a weekly basis to practice verbalizing interpersonal emotions as they arise and to share the emotionally significant story of their lives over time. Jacob, I once heard you say in the Masters of Group Therapy Club that you run and that I'm a member of and that I highly recommend. I've gotten so much out of it. We meet 3 times a week and geek out about group, and it's the highlights of my week. You said a prerequisite is a willingness to be affected by the other. They have a here and now focus. The type of group that I like to run at least has that here and now focus. People obviously talk about their lives, but we try to focus as much as possible on what's happening in the room between people. All feelings are welcome, including the more aggressive ones. And I think of it as an interpersonal meditation, really just trying to be present with other people and what they bring up in me. They can be serious and playful. I think of them as a tolerance practice. We're learning to tolerate difficult emotions and sit with them and put voice to them. be curious about them. And it's an integration practice. I once heard my supervisor say that we're in group to discover and integrate parts that have been split off. And Louis Ormont is a big name in this field. He was one of the earliest practitioners of group psychotherapy based on a psychoanalytic model and the first to establish an all-group private practice. There's a life goal. And he founded the Center for Group Studies in 1989. So Ormont also said of process groups that to people with interpersonal difficulties, the group context serves as a microcosm of reality and is the ideal place to solve real problems. He says we rest everything on the premise that whatever their problems are in the outside world, they will be manifested in the group and can be resolved right in front of us. The aim of group treatment is not to help people socialize better, though that should happen. The aim is for people to, quote, identify and deal with their own emotional blocks and limitations, and to obtain more inner comfort and a far better ability to realize their potential. He says they should make people better able to love and work. And behind all of that is the primary function of group work, which Ormont says is, quote, to stimulate real consciousness, which to me sounds very spiritual. So what is spirituality? I like to think of it as learning how to be alive. I put that in italics because not just learning how to live, but how to be alive, which is often not pleasant. Accepting life on life's terms, and those terms are hardcore. Just being born itself is really traumatic, and then we have to lose things we love, and we have to endure pain and loss and our own death and everything in between. It's never problem-free. Cultivating courage, I think, is a big part of the spiritual journey. And cultivating compassion and self-love. I don't think you can have spirituality without some element of love. Becoming more of yourself. Again, I italicize that because we never reach the pinnacle. We never stop. We never get there. It's this constant becoming. Uncovering your true nature and uncovering truth in general. And that is different, I would say, from finding any sort of answer. I'm just referring to what is actually happening here in this moment. That's truth. Waking up, becoming more conscious, or as Ormont would say, stimulating real consciousness. Reducing unnecessary suffering. And then this idea of connection. People often say connecting to something bigger than myself. And I would argue there's nothing bigger than yourself. I would say, like Alan Watts, that you are the works. Everything that there is represented in you. So connecting with that. And also this idea of not abandoning yourself, staying in connection. You know, when things get hard, will you be able to stay connected to that inner authority, if you will? So I would say that all these definitions can pretty much be summed up in this one, which my lovely supervisor, Pamela Millis, once said in a supervision session with me. She's practicing here in Asheville. She runs 5 groups. She's the one who got me into group. I consult with her on my groups, and I once heard her say that spirituality is getting beyond conditioning. And that has always stuck with me. I love that definition. And I love how it's pretty secular. I think a lot of people could get on board with this. So each of us is conditioned in our own unique ways, and we're also conditioned in universal ways. But based on society and our family upbringing, you know, we all have different types of conditioning. Some people might be conditioned to be people pleasers, or to never express anger, or I don't know, any number of things. We're conditioned in so many ways. But I would argue that there's 2 types of universal conditioning, and these are emphasized a lot in modern analysis. I would say that they are transference and resistance. So Ormont defines transference as the sum total of perceptions, reactions, ideas, and feelings from the patient's past that he brings to the present. He says every member misperceives in his very expectations of what the others will be like and how they will treat him even before he meets them. And this to me speaks to a dreamlike quality that we bring to life, overlaying these things from our past to make what is happening maybe not what's really happening, which brings to mind Ram Dass, one of my favorite spiritual teachers, saying life is but a dream, obviously quoting row, row, row your boat. This is from the beautiful documentary about him, Ram Dass Walking Home, I think it's called. It's on Netflix. It's just 30 minutes long. It's about his final days. I highly recommend. It's very comforting and beautiful. But this notion of life is but a dream, Jacob one time in one of our club meetings asked the very intriguing question when a club member was talking about a problem she was having with her child. If this were a dream, what might it be saying? And that led to a really fruitful discussion and ended up being very helpful for that person to think of it in that way. We also use a lot of fantasy language in group, or at least the groups I've been in. Well, I'm having the fantasy that you're mad at me, or, any number of things that we think about people are actually fantasies and dreams. And this notion of transference, I feel like, is similar to that. And we also stretch imaginal relational muscles, often quite playfully in group. So we get to be playful with our fantasies and our dreams and our transferences. Paul Tillich, in the book, The Courage to Be, says, you may have a precise, detached knowledge of another person, his psychological type, and his calculable reactions. But in knowing this, you do not know the person, his centered self, his knowledge of himself. Only in participating in his self will you know him. And I think this is what we try to do in group. We get to hear what people's fantasies are, and obviously we get to hear their real life stories and really participate in their being in a way that we don't get to do in normal life. And I would say that this is also a way of loving people. And it reminds me of Anthony de Mello, another of my favorite spiritual teachers. I actually credit his book Awareness for putting me on the path I'm on right now, which I read, 15 years ago or so. It's called Awareness, the Perils and Opportunities of Reality. He was a Indian Jesuit priest and psychotherapist and teacher and public speaker. And his definition of love is one of my favorites. He says, love means to see a person, a situation, a thing as it really is, not as you imagine it to be, or maybe not as you want it to be, not as you think it should be, and to give it the response it deserves. And I think that response piece is really important. Love as an action, as a verb. How are we actually responding to people? And this also reminds me, or when I read Howard Thurman recently, I was reminded of this Anthony de Mello. Thurman's definition is very similar. This is love to him. Each person meets the other where he is and there treats him as if he were where he ought to be, which is just so beautiful, I think. And this is at least what I try to do as a group leader, and certainly as a therapist, with individual clients. I don't know if all group members are doing this all the time, but as a leader, I try to have this attitude. Everybody is where they should be, and I'm going to respond to them accordingly and not try to make them be somewhere else or someone else or some way else. So we're not trying to change people. We're just being with them in the purest sense, with no resistance. So that's the other type of conditioning. Ormont again defines resistances as activities whose aim is to keep truths from emerging. Such truths as, I'm afraid, or I hate you, or I have sexual feelings toward you. He says resistances must be carried on in the dark, and indeed, resistances may be said to manufacture darkness, since the function of a resistance is to conceal a truth from oneself if one knows fully what the truth is and how one conceals it. A resistance itself becomes worthless. He says only by becoming aware of their resistances can our group members put them aside if they so wish. And he refers to a Jung phrase, the antiseptic power of consciousness. So this focus on awareness and what truths we're trying to conceal just smacks of spirituality to me. And suffering, this is you, Jacob, actually, you once said, suffering happens when the conscious and unconscious minds are in opposition. So group, again, and individual therapy, I'm sure as well. I just feel like group is potentially more potent, helps bring unconscious material into consciousness. So there's less suffering. We're reducing unnecessary suffering as one aim of spiritual practice and one aim of group. I heard Macario Geraldo, Lacanian psychoanalyst, that's about as smart as they come, intellectual as they come, I guess, say on the Group Dynamics Dispatch podcast. I don't know if you haven't heard that podcast, I highly recommend it. It's Angelo Ciliberti. I just got to see him graduate from CGS. That was really special. And he interviewed Macario Geraldo, who said this, I believe in God because I believe in the unconscious. Which I'm sharing because I just think it's a really thought-provoking quote. I can't say that I can explain it per se, but again, Jacob, you once said in the unconscious, there are all possibilities. And I know I've heard Elliot say this. There's, the unconscious doesn't know the word no. That's another way to say it. And the goal is to increase our willingness as leaders to be the vessel for any possibility. So in the unconscious, there are all possibilities. I believe in God because I believe in the unconscious. God being all possibility, I would say, could be a good definition of God, or one that resonates with me. And here's Ormond again. He says, because group treatment both provides the arena and offers the members an opportunity for spontaneous introspection, which we do not often get in real life, it enables people to label and capture their truly actuating feelings and motives. And I put emphasis on actuating because I think that's a really important word. It's a really cool word. You don't see that one a lot. It's different from activating, I would say. To me, it implies actualization, self-actualization, becoming more actual, perhaps, which reminds me of Martin Buber, the Austrian-Israeli philosopher and scholar, interpreter, and translator of Hasidic lore, best known for his philosophy of dialogue, as explicated in his 1923 book, I Am Now, which I read for the first time a few months ago, having seen it referenced many times in other of my spiritual readings, and was so struck by how much the ideas in that book can be applied to the group process and process groups. And he says, the more a human being is dominated by the ego, the more does the I fall prey to inactuality. So there's another version of this term that I'm playing around with here. He says, egos appear by setting themselves apart from other egos. Persons appear by entering into relation to other persons. So not that separateness. It says to forget yourself or your ego is to be, oh, I'm sorry, this is Dogen Zenji. So here I'm making a connection to much more Buddhist and specifically Zen ideas. Dogen said that to forget yourself is to be realized by all things. And that's another way of saying to forget your ego is to be realized by all things. Suzuki Roshi, another Zen teacher that I'll talk about later, he says, when you include everything, that is the real self. This is also the Zen concept of big mind. And he also said to meet yourself is to practice with people. So that's certainly what we're doing in group. And to see, obviously we can see that we're not as different as we think we are. And that's a pretty basic, I'd say, common experience that happens in group, that we're not as separate as we think or different. But in I and Thou, Buber talks a lot about the you world versus the it world, similar to Kierkegaard's concept of being versus having. And this makes me think of group so much. I like to think of group as the you world, and we're pretty much in the it world most of the time. This is, as Buber says, the world in which one has to live. We can't avoid it. And we can also live quite comfortably in the it world. And in group, we're more about exploring discomfort. But he says it even offers us all sorts of stimulations and excitements, activities and knowledge. He calls it a firm and wholesome chronicle. That's the it world. And he says that you moments, you with a capital Y, appear as queer lyric dramatic episodes. I like to think of group as a queer lyric dramatic episode. He says, without it, capital I, a human being cannot live, but whoever lives only with that is not human. So in the it world, we're either looking to use or we're looking to be useful. But in the you world, those transactional elements don't exist. So it's a place of being instead of having. And the typical concepts of usefulness don't apply. This has come up. I actually introduced this concept to one of my groups, and they really appreciated it because they were really wanting to be helpful. I mean, that's such a common human urge, or to problem solve. And they want to say something useful. And I was encouraging them, the most helpful, useful thing you can do in this world is say what you're really thinking and feeling, and preferably toward another person. That's going to be most transformative for everyone involved. So Buber says the individual you with a capital Y must become an it. We have to go back into the it world. We can't stay in the you world all the time. It's just not possible. When the event of relation has run its course, we leave the group room, we go back into the real world. And he says the individual it can become a you by entering into the event of relation. So itness is unavoidable. You-ness is maybe more of a choice or something we cultivate. And he says all actual life is encounter. Man becomes an I through a you. And this reminds me again of Paul Tillich, who says, only in the continuous encounter with other persons does the person become and remain a person. He also says, a self which has become a matter of calculation and management has ceased to be a self. It has become a thing or an it. He says you must participate in a self in order to know what it is. But by participating, you change it. And life is change after all. So learning how to be alive, changing things by participating in them, not resisting. And I just think this is so beautiful. The form that confronts me, I cannot experience nor describe. I can only actualize it. And yet I see it radiant in the splendor of the confrontation, far more clearly than all the clarity of the experienced world, that's the it world. Not as a thing among the internal things, not as a figment of the imagination, transference, but as what is present. So we're not in group to get something from people, to have even an experience. He kind of thinks of experience in a unique way, but to participate in them and thereby actualize them and actualize ourselves. Buber says the purpose of relation is the relation itself, touching the you, capital Y. For as soon as we touch a you, we are touched by a breath of eternal life, which perhaps could be another reference to God. Walter Kaufman, in his foreword to the 1974 translation, which he translated of I and Thou, says this: God is present when I confront you, but if I look away from you, I ignore him. As long as I merely experience or use you, I deny God. But when I encounter you, I encounter him. Kaufman was a German-American philosopher, translator, and poet. And this again reminds me of Howard Thurman, who I read pretty recently, thanks to one of my podcast guests mentioning him as a hero. I had never heard of him until recently, but he was a Christian mystic from the civil rights era and the first dean of Rankin Chapel at Howard University, first Black dean of a chapel at a majority white university. He was a key mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., who is said to have carried around his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, in his various civil rights travels. And he also wrote 20 other books on theology, religion, and philosophy, including one called Deep is the Hunger, Meditations for Apostles of Sensitiveness, which I just love. I want to be an apostle of sensitiveness. But he uses the phrase, a complete and devastating sincerity, in his book, in the chapter on deception. And he says that this kind of sincerity is the alternative to deception, and that the acceptance of it is to be simply, directly truthful, whatever may be the cost in life, limb, or security. So this is also what we're trying to do in group. And he says sincerity in human relations is equal to and the same as sincerity to God. Man's relation to man and man's relation to God are one relation. And this reminds me of Ram Dass again, one of my favorite American spiritual teachers. He said, treat everyone you meet like they are God in drag. So we're all just manifestations of the same consciousness walking around in different meat suits. And along these same lines, Howard Thurman, he says, the crucial question is, can this loving, truthful attitude or way of being developed in the white heat of personal encounter, can this become characteristic of one's behavior even when the drama of immediacy is lacking? I like to think of that as group drama of immediacy. He says he thinks it can be, and that it has to be rooted in concrete experience. No amount of good feeling for people in general, no amount of simple desiring is an adequate substitute. It is the act of inner authority, well within the reach of everyone. Obviously, then, merely preaching love of one's enemies or exhortations, however high and holy, cannot, in the last analysis, accomplish this result. At the center of the attitude is a core of painstaking discipline, made possible only by personal triumph. I think group takes some painstaking discipline sometimes, just to show up. We don't always feel like doing that work. But if we don't go, we have to pay anyway, so we keep doing it. And obviously being a leader takes a lot of discipline too. Getting people to stay in touch with themselves can be hard work. And I love this too from Howard Thurman. There's a profound measure of resourcefulness in all life, a resourcefulness that is guaranteed by the underlying aliveness of life itself. And again, group people often talk about how stimulating it is and the aliveness that they feel by these here and now connections with people. And that aliveness is our greatest resource, I would say. And the trick is to not resist it, because it's always there. well, I'm going to move into the Zen portion of the program now, going from Howard Thurman, Baptist minister, to one of my favorite Zen teachers, and how they're basically saying the same thing. This underlying aliveness of life itself concept reminded me of something Edward Espe Brown said. Suppose that enlightenment is just the basic nature of reality. You don't have to strive for it. It's just the underlying aliveness of life itself. And that our striving for enlightenment is probably actually a resistance to it. A resistance to simply receiving or being with what's already there. And he also says, find your stability in that which you are. This is the man I'm referring to, Edward. I'm on a first name basis with him. He does 5 days a week Dharma talks, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 a.m. for him. He's in California. And I attend those whenever I can. I can't do it 5 days a week, but I try to do it at least 2 days a week. And so everything I'm going to say about him or quoting him is what I've heard in those talks and written down. And I first discovered him through this documentary that I have listed here, How to Cook Your Life, which I own on DVD and still watch periodically as a kind of comfort food. And it is about cooking, but it's also about Zen, and he uses tons of cooking metaphors. He is most well known for the Tassajara bread book, which he published in 1970 and is still selling lots of copies of. And he has a book called No Recipe and also one called The Most Important Point and some others. And he was ordained by Shunryu Suzuki, who I'll talk about as well. And he quotes Suzuki Roshi a lot in his talks and was obviously loved that man a lot and learned a lot from him. And How to Cook Your Life, that documentary is, there's also a book by the same title that I highly recommend. It's actually the book that I say made me fall in love with Zen Buddhism, which is a commentary on the Tenzo Kyokun, or Instructions for the Cook, by Dogen Zenji, who founded the Soto Zen school. So that's a wonderful book, a commentary on instructions for the cook. But it, in talking about cooking, it's talking about everything, which is what Zen does. So Edward says enlightenment could also be called attaining intimacy. Obviously, this is what we're doing in group. And he says we can be intimate with every moment. He says, maybe instead of asking, how are you doing? We could say, how's it doing? Referring to the moment. How's this moment doing? And how connected are you to it? And he says also that the aim of practice is to be located here, not dissociated. And he's talking about meditation, but I think it can be applied to what we're doing in group as well. It's a kind of interpersonal meditation. Where am I in this moment with these people? Where am I? He says, will you abandon yourself when things get hard? Or can you still be located here? He also says, there's no strategy that's going to get you through unscathed. And so the question is, when you get thrown off, as often happens in group, people are very triggering. How do you get back? How do you get back into your body, your bones, your breath, back to center? He says, in centering ourselves, we gather our resources. And in group, those resources can be the other members. So this idea of there being no strategy that's going to get you through unscathed, that means we have to have courage. We're going to get hurt. So how can we go into whatever situation with more courage? And we're very vulnerable as human beings. We start off probably more vulnerable than most creatures from day one. And in group, again, I'll quote Jacob, maybe you didn't make this up, but you once said the invitation is to lead with vulnerability. And I love that phrase. And that takes courage. might be somewhat paradoxical, but leading with vulnerability takes courage, and there's no way around it. As Paul Tillich says, no absolute and no final security is possible. Life demands again and again the courage to surrender some or even all security for the sake of full self-affirmation, which makes me think of this safe space versus brave space concept that I heard also on the group dynamics dispatch. Marcy Turner was the one I heard say this. She maybe didn't make it up, but she says group is not a safe space. It's a brave space. And I think our culture is way obsessed with safety. And I think you can't always be safe. If you're always safe, you're probably not really living. So group is a great place to practice this semi-safeness, if you will. I think we became even more obsessed with safety during COVID. And I feel like you can't go to any store without somebody telling you to stay safe. And I'm always tempted to say in response, live dangerously. Quote Nietzsche at him. He said, live dangerously, build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. So that's something we can practice in group as well. And that's in, service of full self-affirmation. And Howard Thurman was saying something similar when he was talking about that kind of honesty, that sincere, that devastating honesty, regardless of life or limb. You do this in order to really live. So back to this notion of not getting through unscathed, I think I made this connection with what the Buddha once said. You always have 83 problems I can't help you with. This is the story that Edward told one morning. I think 83 is great. It's just such a specific kind of random number, but also probably pretty realistic and accurate. He says, you'll always have these 83 that I can't do anything to help you with. It's the 84th problem I can help you with, and that is that you wish you didn't have any problems. So in group, obviously this will come up a lot. There's going to be people in there that you don't like, that feel problematic to you, that you really can't do anything about. So to maybe take this attitude and maybe have some more openness to it, and more awareness around your desire to have no problems. And this just being another example of that. So it's not a lack of problems that we need. It's never going to happen. It's courage, it's stamina, it's resilience, it's patience. That's what's really needed. As Edward says, it's like this here. We have problems and things to work on, and it's perfect. It's just as it's supposed to be. So it's not a problem to have problems. So this quote also made me think of group, and Edward mentions this story a lot with Suzuki Roshi saying, taste the true spirit of the grain. And he's talking about oatmeal in this case, and how people at the Zen monastery wanted to put milk and sugar and all kinds of stuff on their oatmeal to make it taste the way they want it to taste. And he says you can do that, or you can taste it as it is. You can put milk and sugar on your experience, or you can chew and swallow and digest it as it is. And the same goes for, how you experience other people, obviously. And this ties into the notion of working with the ingredients you've been given, which Edward talks about a lot. However good or bad they are, you put forth the same sincere effort in working with them. And this is in the Tenzo Kyokun, that instructions for the Zen cook. We're tempted to talk badly about certain produce or something. We think it sucks, it's got a bruise or whatever, but you work with the ingredients you've been given. And this guy, Suzuki Roshi, would actually purposely buy bruised produce because he knew other people wouldn't, and he would work with it. So this really helped me recently when I was having a lot of trouble with a certain group member who was just taking up so much space in the group and also in my own mind between groups, and just kind of wishing he wasn't there, he wasn't in the group, and just wondering, what am I going to do about this person? And just realizing, he's one of the ingredients. He's part of the stew, and I have to work with the ingredients I've been given. Taste this person, as he really is, and meet him where he is, and not try to put milk and sugar on him, and see how it feels and see how it tastes. So this could also be a fun question to pose to group members. What are people tasting right now? You wishing this tasted differently? And it also reminds me of another favorite Buddhist teacher of mine, Dave Smith. He's wonderful. He says the mind is obsessively, repetitively indulging in trying to create an experience that would be more favorable, maybe more flavorable than this one. So this is a great thing to work with in group as a member and a leader. Edward says, we are simply studying how to be in relationship with the objects of our awareness. That's all it is. And in group, those objects are the other group people or other group members, and they could also certainly be our own emotions and thoughts and transferences and associations, all that. It's just studying. He says we're working on the way that we relate to things. In meditation, he says we follow the breath. We don't try to make it be a certain way. So it's the difference between relating and managing, or connecting and controlling. We want to be more in the relate or in the connection and relating. Yeah. It's more about relation and connection than management and control, basically. And obviously, our own emotions can be the objects of our awareness. This is how anger feels. And in group, can we be in that with you? You don't have to do it alone. Maybe the group can just be with you in this moment, in your anger, in your sadness, in your desire, whatever it might be. And then we notice our inclination to get back to what's familiar and comfortable. It is so, so fast. It kicks in so quickly. I know for me, it happens all the time. It's remarkable. Let's get back to what's familiar and comfortable. Well, what would it mean, or what might it be like to stay a little longer in what's uncomfortable? And how might we help each other slow down and be with this moment more fully? That's the beauty of the group. So just a little more info on this man who I so wish I could have met. Seems like such a wonderful soul. Founded the first Zen Buddhist monastery outside of Asia. That's the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, and then also the San Francisco Zen Center, which is huge to this day. And he's very well known for his book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and for saying, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. And he says, when we lose beginner's mind, we lose possibilities of growing into the next moment. So I really try to come into group with beginner's mind, with this not knowing attitude. I've said this to my groups before. Some of you are trying to be good students. Why don't you be yourselves? I'll get to know you better that way. And he also said, you're perfect just as you are, and there's room for improvement, which is life. And we are life. So that makes sense that we would be the same. That kind of paradox or contradiction also reminds me of the Zen or Buddhist, I guess, notion of emptiness, which gets really misunderstood. It's not the best word. It's more like boundlessness. But Edward has likened it to ungraspability. He says there's no way to grasp our true nature. It's not something that's static or concrete. It's ephemeral, and it's paradoxical and always changing, just like life. What isn't changing is dead. So, and he says, maybe what you really want is to keep the question, to not be able to grasp. Maybe you want to keep the question, not have the answer, because the answer is a kind of end. So that's also a kind of death. All right, we're almost here at the end. Wanted to share this Rilke quote, which Edward shared. So he talks we do a 15-minute free write. He talks for 15 minutes. We meditate for 25 minutes. And at the end of every meditation, he reads a poem or recites a poem. Rilke is one of the ones. This isn't a poem, but it's from Letters to a Young Poet. Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. And that's the thing I've heard about enlightenment is that once you're enlightened, you don't say you're enlightened, right? You don't necessarily even notice it. So living your way into the answer, how do you do that? You follow the aliveness. This is another one of my favorite spiritual teachers. Not just a pretty face. This lady is the real deal. I think she's one of the great spiritual leaders of our time. Yoga with Adrienne. I do her yoga videos pretty much every day. And I heard her say this in one of I think it was like a joy themed yoga video. But I see so many connections between yoga and group as well. And obviously yoga as a kind of spiritual path. You notice how hard you're trying. You notice how you clench things in a certain pose that you don't need to clench, and how hard you are on yourself and how much you resist. That's a huge way to practice noticing resistance is doing yoga. You hold your breath, getting more in touch with the physical sensation of your experience. It's a very helpful adjunct to being in group. She also likes to say, find what feels good, breathe like you love yourself. She likes to quote Shakespeare, see feelingly. I think that's a lovely idea. And then lastly, she talks about finding the joy and that this is giving myself permission to participate and engage in activities and practices that support me being me. That's obviously group. And we're not wearing a disguise or hiding, but putting myself in situations where I can safely-ish explore who I am so that I can get strong and be steady within that inner authority, that becoming more of yourself, that finding your stability in that which you are, to quote Edward again. That's the end of the slide portion of the program. And now we can talk. I'm sorry that you, dear podcast listener, can't be privy to the conversation that followed that lecture. It was really a great one, really awesome group of people with really active, engaged minds were in attendance. But I thank you so much for listening to this edited version of my Group as Spiritual Practice lecture here on Time and Other Thieves. I'm Sarah B., and I'm going to edit another lecture that I gave on Zoom much more recently on December 11th of 2025 called A Stoic's Guide to Group. And that's where I apply some of the ideas from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations to the practice of group psychotherapy and specifically interpersonal process groups. The obsession continues, people. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you know that I fell in love with groups a couple years ago and have not looked back. I indeed continue to add more and more groups to my life and feel more and more enlivened by them as I continue to learn. So thanks again for listening. I hope you'll check out the next episode. And if you ever want to shoot me an email, feel free to do so at sarahbsimpson@protonmail.com. Take care.